Welcome back, everybody, to Two Guys and a Stack of Comics. It is Sunday, so it is our weekly breakdown of Watchmen. We're going to do a chapter two, Absent Friends. Mike and I, for the next 12 weeks, we're going to go through the classic graphic novel Watchmen. You can find this in many different forms, but we're just going to go issue by issue and break it down and go through our thoughts on the issue, why we think this story stands out so much, and why it is the classic that it is, and whether you love it or whether you hate its impact on the modern age. I think it's definitely a story that is worth reading. We encourage you guys as well, if you guys want to read along with us and let us know your thoughts down below on the issue as we break it down. All right, so chapter two, we have the first issue. What's interesting is first issue of Watchmen, when you really read it, could still be a standard superhero comic. You could say it's a little rough around the edges. Some of the dialogue probably more than you were seeing in the 80s from these characters from the worlds of DC and Marvel. Issue two is where we kick things into high gear. This is where you realize we are dealing with a different beast. This is not your standard superhero comic. And while for us in 2025, that is very normal. 1986, this was probably the issue where people were like, whoa, this is a little
What is
different.
going on here, right? Yeah.
I think, starting to look at the issue, and Mike and I kind of run through the major story points and what stands out to us. Um, Obviously the setting of this is we're obviously doing the comedian's funeral. So we see a lot of the characters introduced in the first issue, and we see their reactions to this funeral and their reflections on the comedian, which more, I think, brilliantly juxtapositions the reflections they have on Edward Blake with the reflection of who this character actually is. And the moment that they see is kind of a great reflection of who the character will be. Um, so we start out, in this story, Mike, we have the two Silk Spectres interacting. We have a great mother and daughter conversation.
I
And what
love
strikes
this.
you about that scene, sir?
I love the setup of the mother and daughter because here you have the two generations of superheroing in the family, the mother and then passing it on to the daughter. But I really love how Alan Moore sets up the multi-generation mother-daughter sequence here to say what he wants to say about the story, and get you prepared. Although probably in 1986, nobody was really prepared for where all this was going. This was a different kind of animal, like you said. And this issue is where it really would have hooked you as the reader if you were buying this off the stands. And, here she is, she's talking to her mother, and her mother is not a big fan of how things happen. She
Hmm.
kind of retired, and the daughter, was supposed to follow in her footsteps. And then the whole Keene Act took an effect, and superheroes were outlawed or whatever. But I love the little interaction with them. The little infighting that mothers and daughters have together is very present, and it feels relatable. Like, we all know the women in our lives and how mothers and daughters are. There's always a little bit of back and forth, and that's very much it.
Differing perspectives. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I love how insightful he was to that relationship and brought it into the story, and just some of the things that they talk about. Her chastising her daughter for her choice of husband. I didn't have to marry an H bomb. You know, yeah,
No,
and stuff
you
like
get a brilliant mix of a disappointing mother or a
yeah,
mother who's disappointed in her child and a child who's
yeah,
disappointed in the mother for very different reasons. Right. You
right,
see that, Sally, the older Silk Spectre, doesn't like that her daughter smokes,
yeah,
which I think for anybody who's been through, seeing that, it's an interesting, very relatable sort of story beat.
yeah.
You also get the very much the disapproval of the relationship with Dr. Manhattan. I think you kind of position it the other way where the daughter can't understand. She goes in there and she's like, it's a funeral. She's trying very hard not to mention the comedian
And
because
she's
of
like,
what
"Oh,
the
I read
impact.
the papers. I read the papers, hun.
Yeah.
I know." So Eddie's dead, huh? Yeah, and
No,
she,
and it's a great. I think what more touches on there is, it's the line from Sally and the thing of Lori every day. The future looks a little. I'm 65. The future looks a little darker, and the past looks a little brighter, and it's interesting because, even though I'm not near that age, I think it's one of those things where as you get older, some of the things that maybe defined your childhood or moments that really, colored things in a negative light, as you get older, you look back at those things and it's very, you know,
Oh
it's
yeah.
not as bad, right? It's easier to look at the past with rose-colored glasses than it is with the future, I think, especially as you get older. And more being able to touch on that again, it just shows why this work of fiction hits so many people different ways, and that the dialogue is very precise. Every panel is intentional. There's nothing wasted. And it's amazing how many human elements he touches on, even just simple interaction like that to
Well,
kick off the book.
yeah, I mean, and he nails it in so many different places in this book. But I love that. I love that scene. It's one of my favorites, and I especially love the part at the end where they're talking about this fan of hers, and she's like, "Mother, that's disgusting," and that's just terrible. And he's like, "Well,
Underground comics and things like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah," and she's like, "Well, at least I didn't have to marry an H bomb." And then the only difference, yeah. Anyway, and then she goes
She's
on to
saying,
say,
things are tough all over, cupcake, it
"Okay,
rains on
I
the
love
just
that
and the
part."
unjust. Yeah,
Yeah, things are tough all over, Cupcake, but the rain it rains on the just and the unjust alike, and that is just like that line right there. Kind of, you know, uh, paints it with a broad stroke over the whole story because these characters are just and they're unjust, and some are more unjust than others, and some are maybe a little more just than others. But nobody is without a taint in this story,
No,
right?
I think we start getting, you get the first flashback, obviously, of the comedian's attack on the original Silk Spectre. And while that is a brutal moment and something, again, very different from your standard comic fare at that time,
Oh,
something we'd see a lot in indie books now. But for your standard comic fare back in, it's an interesting perspective shift. And that's what Moore does such a good job through the book with is he never really presents anybody as 100% right or anybody's 100% wrong. Like you said, some folks are in that 99% wrong and some
yeah.
are, 80% good. And so it's interesting is that attack by Blake, obviously you don't empathize with the comedian. It makes him a despicable person. But, Sally, who actually suffered that, has this different perspective of it's in the past. I don't want to be, whereas the daughter is very much that man did that. How can you even, see him as like a human being or mourn his loss at all? Again, it's just great touch of writing in that you will meet people in life who do have where something happened to them and their perspective is not what you think it should be,
Yeah,
even though
and
they're the one who suffered it.
that's totally relatable to the average person as well. And again, it's Alan Moore trying to take the average person into this crazy world of superheroes and what if they were real? And yeah,
Yeah, just does a great job with it. The remaining portion or the next sort of portions of the issue, you get these flashbacks, and again, it's stuff like Ozymandias at the funeral and how he views, and so he has this flashback, obviously, of when he's part of the Crime Busters and his interaction with the comedian. And again, it's brilliant foreshadowing, and the scene that Ozymandias remembers is his thing about, hey, we need to have a more world view to these problems, right? We need to use intelligence to solve them, which is great foreshadowing for what eventually he will be doing. You get the scene where the comedian, burns the map, and it kind of just shows how, off the rails he was. It's just a great look at the way these characters see the comedian, what it says about them themselves.
yeah. And Gibbons stuck pretty much to the 9 grid panel. And
Hmm.
then he would do these brilliant things like almost cinematic things where you see Ozymandias at the funeral and then you go right into this flashback. And I love the way Gibbons and Moore married the flashback in this. On one hand, you know, flashbacks are kind of dealt with heavy handedly, in my opinion, these days. But the way he intricately wove the flashback into the present tense throughout the issue is masterful. And Gibbons, of course, matching him panel for panel with art, just does a wonderful job of transitioning. it's just
No, I
amazing.
think the other part you talk about that passage of time piece, the way the comedian's outfit sort of evolves throughout, where it kind of starts with what would be a very standard sort of golden age superhero costume. And then, when we get the 60s, there's a flashback, he's a little more armored up and bulked up, and then, it kind of moves on. We get Manhattan's flashback, which is always the one that strikes with me the most, and that you get this flashback to Nam. This is the first time where the book really starts taking it. We're in an alternate timeline, where America very clearly had a victory in Vietnam. Nixon is still the president. But you get this interesting moment where, the comedian again does something despicable, shoots this pregnant Vietnamese woman who, we're led to believe is having his child. And Manhattan, the way you can view it is, man, how despicable is the comedian? But then again, the comedian, again, where he's a great character, you don't
He
like
turns it
him.
around.
That turnaround of, you're judging me, you think I'm awful, and I am, but you could have stopped this whole thing. You could have prevented all of it, and yet you stood there and you let it happen.
Yeah,
And again, it's a brilliant foreshadowing of Manhattan. It's a brilliant foreshadowing of what his eventual role and the struggle and the defining thing of him as a character is. His detachment from humanity almost makes his power useless, right? Like he can do
it really
anything, but
does.
because he doesn't possess that empathy, it absolutely ends up haunting him. You go again, next flashback we go through, you get I love this panel. I just always thought that was such a cool ship design. I love,
Oh,
taking these
yeah,
characters, like Night Owl and stuff and giving them tech and equipment and things, because you can tell there's so much inspiration probably taken from characters like Blue Beetle, Batman, different characters that
oh,
are there.
right.
These Charlton characters, so this is probably more Blue Beetle they're going for. But I love,
Yeah,
again, a great flashback scene where they kind of flip it, where the comedian is taking these sort of awful actions and he's shooting at protesters. And it's led to believe really like the Keene Act is probably what's causing this, and cops are on strike. And so the vigilantes are trying to have to do, crowd control. But again, you get that flip of, Night Owl. He remembers the comedian one way. You can also look at the other end of Night Owl's kind of just sitting on his butt doing nothing. Very much like Dan's kind of
yeah,
defining thing through most of this story is, where he's like, well, I'm just following orders, right? While
yeah.
the comedian's doing all this. And I think that's one of the cool things Moore does is the way that he just instantly in all of these scenes in the flashbacks flips a mirror from the comedian onto the comedian has a grain of truth despite how despicable he is in almost everything he's saying in the critiques of the characters that even show in the way these characters viewed him.
Yeah, and he almost revels in the chaos because of the character of who he is. And at the end of this issue, there's a defining quote that we'll go back through and see. But again, the art from Gibbons, like I love the way that during the funeral, Dr. Manhattan has that line of white around him,
Yep.
like a halo, and it's just the way they depicted it back then. Of course, in the movie, it got CGI'd up, but I think it was just very, it's something little. Like I said, like we were saying, when you read this through, like I probably haven't read this in 5 years. This is maybe like the fourth time I've read this. Um, you pick up different little things, and that's something I never noticed. How he had this outline
Well, when
throughout.
he's in the rain, yeah, that little
Yeah,
outline shows, and then in all the
yeah,
other scenes where he's indoors, you don't see it.
yeah,
Um, no, other little stuff that's real cool. You look at the dialogue bubbles, like when Rorschach's talking every other time in the story. It has this very gritty look to the lettering and all that
yeah,
kind of showing that more gravelly voice that you imagine Rorschach has. It's funny, it's in the flashbacks, he doesn't have that, right? In the flashbacks, when they show him when he's a part of the team and he's working with Dan, very standard dialogue bubble,
and
right? And
I
again, it's one of
never
those things
noticed that.
where they kind of foreshadow, like Dan's talking in his flashback to the comedian, and they're talking about how something happened to Rorschach, right? Rorschach had this kidnapping incident happen, and it sort of made him break a little bit more than he was before. He kind of went off the deep end. And I think, again, that's the cool thing that Moore does with this is what I love about the story is so often in comics now, it almost feels like we're wasting pages. The conversations, I don't mind conversations or dialogue in comics, but they're so often that you're like, what was the point of that? And when you finish the 6 to 12 issue arc, you're like, that really wasn't anything. It almost felt like page filler. The
Yeah.
great thing with Moore is almost every single panel of the story is contributing to a piece of information you're getting about the character, a piece of information that will be important later in the story, or a flaw or a character thing that will show up and define the characters later. And that's just a masterwork of writing to be that proficient in terms of what's on the page. And as a reader, you almost having to pick up everything that's there. Um,
Nothing is wasted.
you
Nothing is
talk
wasted.
you talk about the ending of the book, and I know this is the part that struck both of us the most. You get the confrontation between Moloch and Rorschach, which is kind of the main sort of, again, showing the difference of, right, these other folks are at, the comedian's funeral. Rorschach's the one who, again, is still taking action. I think that's why Rorschach's such an interesting character, is he is the active character in the story, right? Everybody else is kind of almost reacting to the events, whereas Rorschach, you can kind of see why so many people like his point of view in terms of in the story, he's the guy who's always involved. And so you get this great interaction with him and Moloch. And you get two huge gems out of this. One, you get the comedian has this breakdown in front of his villain. And
And
it's
can we
never
talk
really
about
directly 100% addressed, but this is our first indication that something really huge is going to happen. Because it very much is hinted at that the comedian has found out through some means Ozymandias' plan. And even for a human being, and he himself kind of says, I've done despicable things, I've treated women awfully in my life, but even for him, the breadth of what Ozymandias is going to do affects him to where it's broken his point of view. This guy who kind of sees the world as a joke and has this cruel sensibilities to him, even something like that breaks a character like him.
well, can we talk about how in 1986, this you're in issue 2, you have no idea. Of course, we all know what's
What's
going to
coming?
happen
Yeah.
nowadays, but in that moment, you don't know. And can we talk about the colorist again? I mean, the colorist, look at the juxtaposition of the warm and cool colors throughout this double page spread. It's just really masterfully done. And that expression, the middle lower panel, right before you see Warshak, look at the close up of the comedian with the scars on his face. That is very Steve Ditko ish.
Yeah. No, it's a
Yeah,
brilliant use, and I think you mentioned like the colorings. You can I think you're supposed to take it as like a light reflecting in and out of Moloch's room. Again,
yeah.
it's just such great job done by Gibbons throughout. I think we've mentioned it a few times, but that's the weird thing of this book is everyone always gives Alan Moore the credit for the story, and he deserves it. But man, Gibbons, when you really look at it, the art just on every panel, the close-ups, the way everything's presented, like you mentioned earlier, it is so cinematic in its presentation, and that's what really just drives home the story. I think there's another great moment with Rorschach where he finds like the little pill bottle of things that are illegal and kind of
Oh,
holds
yeah.
that against Moloch. And again, just showing Rorschach's, as you mentioned, it's almost like that Ditko influence of things where, Ditko had that morally black and white, you're either good or you're bad.
The Mr. A.
Rorschach kind of
Yeah,
has that attitude in terms of for him, there is a very clear black and white. You may not agree with where his are at, but Rorschach, despite being this character with a lot of personality flaws and positions in the world that most of us probably don't agree with at all, he even has this whole, hey man, if you stepped over the line, you're absolutely bad. I don't care why. And so even though Moloch explains like, hey man, I got cancer. It's the kind of cancer you don't ever get better for. Rorschach doesn't focus on that at all. It's more, no man, you got something illegal in your house.
yeah.
And again, it's one of those defining character traits of Rorschach.
It's so in line with the question, Steve Ditko. And I know Alan Moore was a big fan of Steve Ditko's. And you can tell Dave Gibbons kind of, gave an homage here and there to Steve in some of the great panels. This is just, it's just awesome. And I like what Moloch says at the end. And this is really, this is the funeral issue where we get to learn about the comedian and all the gritty natures of some of these characters. And, it must have been quite a shock in 1986 to pick up this book. And then, you're like 5 pages in and it's talking about a rape scene. And then you're another 5 pages in and the comedian shoots a pregnant woman. And you're probably in 1986. You're probably going, "What the heck?"
What in the heck am I? What the heck is this compared to? Right on the, right
Yes,
next to Action Comics on the table, on it would be
yeah,
very different.
yeah.
I
It,
think, we close out with the end, and you get this again, this perspective shift from Rorschach, where he kind of addresses, and I'll just read directly here. Blake understood and treated it like a joke. He understood and saw the cracks in society, saw the little men in masks trying to hold it together. He saw the true face of the 20th century and chose to become a reflection, a parody of it. No one else saw the joke. That's why he's lonely. And it's not only is that incredibly well written, but it just shows so much about both the characters of Rorschach and the comedian that, like, it's funny in that Rorschach, again, he's the character you think would have the biggest issue with the comedian, given
yeah.
the comedian's actions. But it just shows for him, he has this very weird moral compass for him. And so he kind of almost in a way, it seems like respects the comedian, and that the comedian is a guy that he looks at. No, he's like, no, that guy had it right in his approach to the world, which is very interesting writing.
It really is, because when you think about it, the world's gone crazy. The world's always been crazy. And then he tells the joke about the clown who goes to the psychiatrist,
Oh,
right?
yeah, Chijo. Yeah.
Oh my God, that's so classic. And but it's really insightful, and it gives you insight into where Alan Moore was thinking at the time. That superheroes are crazy, the world's gone crazy, and if somebody had superpowers, what would they do in the madness that is this world? And it gives you that perspective, like, if Alan Moore
It
was the
does make you ask questions. And I think that's the brilliance of Moore in this book. And again, sometimes, you and I have even talked about this. Watchmen's influence on comic books now, I do think was negative, but it doesn't color this story for me because it is so well done. It's sort of, like if you have a player who can shoot a ton of three pointers in basketball, if he can make them, it's not his fault if the next guy can't, right? And if the next guy follows the trend and doesn't do it as well, that's not on the guy who makes all the three pointers. And I think
right,
that's the interesting part with Moore is his examination of heroes. What if they were in the real world? The ego or the sort of mental gymnastics that someone would have to do to think that it's a great idea to throw on a mask and start going out there to take things in your own hands. That examination of, like, how ridiculous would this look in the real world, right? And again, you can say maybe that's not something comics should explore too much, but when you are as good at doing it as Moore does, it makes it fascinating writing, and it makes it why we love this story. I think the other part, Mike, and this is, I think, the greatest thing that Moore does in this book, from a book that presents so many characters, I think what's really cool is in the modern age of comics, I think team books struggle the most because I feel like when you read a book now, they very much have it's a team of six or seven heroes, but I want you to like this one, or this is the writer's favorite, right? Like if you read a modern run of Avengers, you read a modern run of X-Men, it's not really a struggle to figure out who the writer likes the most out of that book. Where Watchmen is so good is he laces all of these characters with enormous flaws, but also things that you relate to. Some of them are 90% awful with 5% of redemption and 5% of kind of morally gray. Others you would probably like, hey, they're like 80% good with 20% of a problem. But what's so great is I think you could hand this to 10 people. They're probably going to walk away with like seven or eight different answers on who the favorite character is, which one you relate to. It's more almost a reflection of you as a reader of like, okay, that's the character you want to follow, or that's one you like. It's just such great character work from him on
yeah.
all of them throughout the book.
You can kind of think with this perspective that we have on Alan Moore's career right now. He took the Golden Age and the Silver Age, and had that transition. Whereas the Minutemen were more like the Justice Society of America, and then the Crime Busters were kind of like the Justice League. A more modern Silver Age version of the older team, and how everything had to be revamped. And he was a kid buying comics in the early 60s when all that was happening. And you can kind of see how and then working in the industry through the 70s, how he was kind of tired of doing superheroes, and
Mhm.
getting ready to go on to bigger and better things. which he did, and then he left the comic book superhero genre with this last masterpiece of what he wanted to say about it, and now it's here for all posterity. And he's gone on and done other great things. But yeah, he really made a statement with this book. And issue 2 was the fork in the road for where this story was going to
Yeah,
go.
the story
It,
drives onto a different path completely. And,
yeah,
and I think the other part, you end it with the prose, obviously, from the original Night Owl. And again, it's Moore's examination of superheroes. And there's so much in that about designing the costume and how he got ready and how dumb the domino mask looks originally. And
yeah,
again, it's a critique of all these things that Moore does well. And it's sad because I think because you and I both have done a lot of videos on this, we hate deconstruction in comic books. What I always like about Moore and where Watchmen is singularly different to me than anything else. While yes, there's a ton of inspiration from the Charlton characters, you can very clearly get the Question as Rorschach and different things like that. What I have always liked about this is Moore created his own world. This story would suck if it was the Justice League. If Dr. Manhattan was Superman and Rorschach was Batman and whatever, right? And those aren't perfect equivalents. I'd hate the story. What I've always liked about this is he designed his own world, he did his own world building, he did his own stuff. And that's why to me it never really stands out as deconstruction so much as what we have now is that
yeah,
he is creating this story as he goes. It's his creations.
and it set the foundation and the stage for what would come in the independent comics, and the boom that we're seeing now in the indies. He was foundational and teaching other creators that if you want to go that way, you can go that way. You just got to have the writing chops like he did, right?
Cute, that kind of
to
story.
to pull it off and create your own world and and tell a story that you want to tell, rather than trying to tell a story you want to tell with somebody else's world, which is what happens a lot now.
No, great issue. As you said, it's the fork in the road issue. This is where things change. As always, folks, let us know. What do you guys think below if you're reading along with us? Would love to see your guys' comments and observations. If there's something that stood out to you that we missed or things we said you agreed with, let us know. We will be back next week for the third part of the 12-part breakdown of Watchmen. Thank you for watching, folks. God bless you. You have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.